Welcome to research into the astrological significance of planetary retrograde density and conflict prediction, building upon the 2001 Afghanistan and 2014 Ukraine studies. Before we get started, if you don't mind, with peace and love, subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing my videos around to keep me in the algorithm to teach you astrology for free. We're going to begin with retrograde motion as a celestial signal. Among the most striking phenomena in observational astronomy is retrograde motion, the apparent backward movement of a planet against the fixed stars. This optical illusion caused by the relative positions and motions of Earth and the other planets has fascinated and troubled observers for millennia. In traditional astrology, retrograde planets are understood to function differently from their direct moving counterparts. Their energies are turned inward, delayed, or expressed in unconventional ways. In this video, we are going to explore a specialized area of mundane astrological research, the significance of planetary retrograde density, the number of simultaneously retrograde planets at a given moment as a predictor of geopolitical conflict, building upon documented studies of the 2001 Afghanistan conflict and the 2014 Ukraine crises. As referenced in the Annals of Celestial Strategy, we examine the theoretical foundations, empirical patterns, and methodological considerations for this line of research. Our approach is rigorous and scholarly, treating retrograde density as a variable to be studied through systematic observation and statistical analysis rather than through anecdotal correlation. Let's go over the phenomenology of retrograde motion, starting with astronomical mechanism. So retrograde motion occurs when Earth, in its faster inner orbit, it overtakes and passes an outer planet, or when an inner planet in its faster orbit laps Earth. From our moving perspective, the planet appears to stop, move backward against the stars for a period, then stop again and resume forward motion. The duration and arc of retrogradation vary by planet. So Mercury retrogrades 3 to 4 times annually for approximately 3 weeks each. Venus retrogrades approximately every 18 months for about 6 weeks. Mars retrogrades approximately every 26 months for about 2 to 3 months. Jupiter retrogrades annually for about 4 months. Saturn retrogrades annually for about 4.5 months. Uranus, Neptune, Pluto retrograde approximately half each year. Alright. So, this is our traditional astrological interpretation. Now, in Jyotish, retrograde planets, also known as Vakri Grahas, understood to have intensified and redirected effects. The classical texts describe them as powerful but unpredictable, like a coiled spring or a restrained elephant. So key principles include the following. Intensification. Retrograde planets exert their influence more strongly due to their proximity to Earth during the retrograde period. Inversion. The planet's energy manifests in unconventional, sometimes opposite ways. Delay. Matters ruled by the planet may be delayed, but ultimately more significant. Past life connection. Retrograde planets indicate unfinished business from previous incarnations. Let's go over the concept of retrograde density. So retrograde density refers to the number of planets in retrograde motion at a given time. When multiple planets are simultaneously retrograde, the combined effect is understood to be greater than the sum of individual effects. High retrograde density periods are traditionally associated with collective introspection and reconsideration of established structures, reversal of policies, trends, or relationships, revelation of hidden information, increased likelihood of unexpected events, weakened effectiveness of institutions and authorities. Here's our theoretical framework why retrograde density might correlate with conflict. Several theoretical considerations support the hypothesis that high retrograde density periods may be conducive to geopolitical conflict, such as disruption of normal channels. So when planets are direct, their energies flow in expected directions. Retrogradation disrupts this flow, potentially manifesting as disruption in the collective affairs ruled by those planets. Multiple simultaneous retrograde planets suggest multiple disrupted systems, increasing the potential for cascading failures and conflicts. So well as hidden information emerging. Retrograde planets are associated with things hidden coming to light, secrets revealed, repressed material emerging, concealed agendas exposed. In international relations, this can mean the discovery of covert operations, the exposure of diplomatic maneuvering, or the revelation of previously unknown facts that trigger conflict. Reversal of established patterns. The backward motion of retrograde planets symbolizes reversal. When many planets are retrograde, we may see reversals of alliances, reversals of policies, or reversals of fortune that create the conditions for conflict. Nations may act contrary to their established patterns, surprising allies and adversaries alike. As well as intensified malefic influence, if retrograde planets are more powerful than retrograde malefics, Mars, Saturn, the nodes are particularly potent, although we need to admit the nodes are always retrograde. And when they're direct, that's when something's up. High retrograde density increases the likelihood that malefics will be among the retrograde planets, intensifying their conflict-promoting potential. Alright, now let's go over our case study, which is the Afghanistan conflict in 2001 in our historical context. On October 7, 2001, the United States and coalition partners launched Operation Enduring Freedom, initiating the war in Afghanistan in response to the September 11th attacks. This marked the beginning of a 2-decade military engagement that would become the longest war in American history. Celestial configuration at initiation. According to the research documented in the Annals of Celestial Strategy, the retrograde density at the initiation of the Afghanistan conflict was exceptional. So on October 7, 2001, the following planets were retrograde. We had Saturn in Gemini, Uranus in Aquarius, Neptune in Aquarius, Pluto in Sagittarius. This configuration of 4 simultaneously retrograde planets, including all 3 outer planets and Saturn, represents a significant retrograde density event. Notably, Mars, the natural significator of war, was direct but closely approaching its own retrograde station, adding additional complexity. Now we have in our analysis, the predominance of retrograde outer planets suggests several interpretive themes. We dissect this. So Saturn retrograde in Gemini. Saturn represents structures, boundaries, and established authority. In Gemini, communication, information, local populations. Retrograde suggests the breakdown of informational structures and the difficulty of establishing stable authority in a complex environment. The retrograde motion indicates that these structural challenges will be persistent and will require unconventional approaches. Uranus, Neptune, Pluto retrograde. The simultaneous retrogradation of all 3 outer planets suggests fundamental disruption at the collective level. So Uranus, the planet of sudden change and revolution, retrograde in Aquarius, its own sign, indicates that the conflict would produce unexpected transformations in global power structures. Neptune, being the planet of illusion, deception, boundaries, retrograde in Aquarius, suggests the difficulty of clearly defining objectives and the role of misinformation. And Pluto, the planet of power, destruction, regeneration, retrograde in Sagittarius, foreign lands, belief systems, points to the profound transformation of Afghanistan and its relationship to the world. The high retrograde density, combined with the specific planets involved, suggests a conflict that would be prolonged. Saturn retrograde, transformative beyond initial intentions. Pluto retrograde, confused in its objectives and outcomes. Neptune retrograde, and destabilizing to established structures. Uranus retrograde. But I'd beg to differ, that's also for Pluto as well. So these themes accurately describe the 2-decade trajectory of the Afghanistan conflict. Now I want to talk about the Ukraine crisis. 2014, so in February through March 2014, following the Euromaidan protests and the ousting of President Yanukovych, Russia annexed Crimea and conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine between Ukrainian government forces and Russian-backed separatists. This marked the beginning of a conflict that would continue for years and fundamentally reshape European security. The research cited in the Annals of Celestial Strategy examines the retrograde density during the critical period of February through March 2014. On March 1st, 2014, as Russian forces moved into Crimea, the following planets were retrograde: Mars, retrograde in Libra, Saturn, retrograde in Scorpio, and Pluto, retrograde in Capricorn. So additionally, Mercury was retrograde earlier in the crisis period, February 6th through the 28th, contributing to the communicative confusion surrounding events. Now, this configuration differs from the Afghanistan case in featuring Mars retrograde, the war planet itself moving backward. The interpretive significance is profound. So Mars retrograde, and in Libra, Mars represents military action, aggression, conflict. In Libra, relationships, partnerships, balance. Retrograde suggests conflict arising from disrupted relationships and the difficulty of achieving balanced resolution. The retrograde motion indicates that military action would not follow conventional patterns and that the aggressor's intentions might be misunderstood or misrepresented. Mars retrograde can also indicate military actions taken in response to perceived threats rather than offensive designs. Saturn retrograde in Scorpio. Saturn represents structures, authority, boundaries, and Scorpio, intensity, secrecy, transformation. Retrograde suggests the breakdown of security structures and the revelation of hidden alliances. The retrograde motion indicates that these structural issues would persist and require unconventional solutions. Pluto retrograde in Capricorn. Pluto represents power, transformation, and underlying forces. Capricorn, government, authority, structures. Retrograde suggests the transformation of governmental authority and the emergence of power dynamics beneath the surface. This placement accurately reflects the role of shadow forces and non-state actors in the conflict. The combination of Mars, Saturn, and Pluto retrograde, three of the most significant malefics, suggests a conflict with deep structural roots, intense power dynamics, and unconventional military dimensions. The absence of retrograde outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, distinguishes this from the Afghanistan case and aligns with the more contained geographic scope of the conflict. Methodological considerations for retrograde density research. Defining the variable. Rigorous research requires clear definition of what constitutes retrograde density. Options include simple count, number of retrograde planets, typically excluding the Sun and Moon, which never retrograde. Weighted count, assigning weights based on planetary significance. For example, outer planets weighed more heavily. Malefic density, counting only retrograde malefics, Mars, Saturn, nodes. Station density, counting planets within a certain orb of their retrograde or direct stations. Establishing baselines. To determine whether retrograde density at conflict onset is significant, we must establish baseline expectations. So average number of simultaneously retrograde planets, typically 3 through 5, as outer planets spend 40% of their time retrograde. Frequency of high-density events, 6 or more retrograde planets. Seasonal and cyclical patterns in retrograde density. Statistical considerations. Research in this area must address several statistical challenges: small sample size, major conflicts or rare events, limiting statistical power, selection bias, the tendency to remember confirming cases and forget non-confirming ones, definitional ambiguity, what counts as a conflict requiring explanation, multiple hypothesis testing. Examining many astrological variables increases the chance of finding spurious correlations. Controlling for other factors. Retrograde density does not operate in isolation. Research must control for or integrate other astrological factors, such as planetary aspects, especially malefic aspects to sensitive points, eclipse patterns preceding conflict, ingresses of malefics into cardinal signs, nodal activations of national horoscopes. Toward a research program, data collection. A systematic research program on retrograde density and conflict would require a conflict database, a comprehensive, well-defined list of conflicts with precise start dates, ephemeris database, planetary positions at high temporal resolution, retrograde identification, automated identification of retrograde periods for each planet, statistical analysis, comparison of retrograde density at conflict onset with baseline expectations. Hypothesis testing. Specific hypotheses amenable to testing include: conflict onset is more likely during periods of above average retrograde density. Conflicts beginning during high retrograde density periods last longer than average. Conflicts beginning with Mars retrograde have different characteristics than those with Mars direct. The specific combination of retrograde planets correlates with conflict type. For example, Pluto retrograde associated with transformative conflicts, Saturn retrograde with structural conflicts. The challenge of prediction. The ultimate goal of such research from an astrological perspective is not merely retrospective understanding, but prospective prediction. So if retrograde density correlates with conflict, can it be used to forecast periods of elevated risk? The Afghanistan and Ukraine cases suggest that high retrograde density may be a necessary but not sufficient condition for major conflict. Many periods of high retrograde density pass without significant conflict. Therefore, prediction would require integrating retrograde density with other factors, such as transits to national horoscopes, especially the Mars, Saturn, Uranus, Pluto configurations of affected nations, eclipses falling on sensitive points, ingresses of malefics into angles of national charts, progressions and directions activating conflict potentials. And we conclude with the promise and limitations of retrograde density research. The study of planetary retrograde density and conflict prediction represents a promising frontier in mundane astrological research. The documented cases of the 2001 Afghanistan conflict and the 2014 Ukraine crises suggest that periods of high retrograde density, particularly when involving malefic planets, may indeed correlate with major geopolitical disruptions. However, this correlation must be approached with scholarly rigor. Anecdotal evidence, however striking, does not constitute proof. Systematic data collection, careful statistical analysis, and transparent methodology are essential if this line of research is to advance beyond the realm of interesting speculation into that of reliable knowledge. The Annals of Celestial Strategy studies provide a foundation upon which further research can build. By refining our definitions, expanding our databases, and subjecting our hypothesis to rigorous testing, we may eventually develop a nuanced understanding of how planet retrograde density contributes to the complex celestial signature of human conflict. With peace and love, thank you for watching this video. In my next one, I hope you subscribe, like, comment. Stay tuned because we're going to be going over advanced Chinese astrology, specifically digital archiving of imperial astrological records spanning 2,500 years, a computational approach to preserving the celestial mandate. These are 4 rigorous essays I wrote on the celestial science of the Middle Kingdom. Stay tuned. Teaching you more astrology. Piscean out.